The Hour of the Dragon by Robert E. Howard. Part 2. Chapter 6. The Thrust of a Knife. Conan stooped and tore the knife from the monster's breast. Then he went swiftly up the stair. What other shapes of fear the darkness held he could not guess, but he had no desire to encounter any more. This touch-and-go sort of battling was too strenuous even for the giant Cimmerian. The moonlight was fading from the floor, the darkness closing in, and something like panic pursued him up the stair. He breathed a gusty sigh of relief when he reached the head and felt the third key turn in the lock. He opened the door slightly and craned his neck to peer through, half expecting an attack from some human or bestial enemy. He looked into a bare stone corridor, dimly lighted, and a slender, supple figure stood before the door. "Your Majesty!" It was a low, vibrant cry, half in relief and half in fear. The girl sprang to his side, then hesitated as if abashed. "You bleed," she said. "You have been hurt." He brushed aside the implication with an impatient hand. "Scratches that wouldn't hurt a baby. Your skewer came in handy though. But for it, Taraskus's monkey would be cracking my shin bones for the marrow right now. But what now?" "Follow me," she whispered. "I will lead you outside the city wall. I have a horse concealed there." She turned to lead the way down the corridor, but he laid a heavy hand on her naked shoulder. "Walk beside me," he instructed her softly, passing his massive arm about her lithe waist. "You've played me fair so far, and I'm inclined to believe in you. But I've lived this long only because I've trusted no one too far, man or woman. So, now, if you play me false, you won't live to enjoy the jest." She did not flinch at sight of the reddened poniard or the contact of his hard muscles about her supple body. "Cut me down without mercy if I play you false," she answered. "The very feel of your arm about me, even in menace, is as the fulfillment of a dream." The vaulted corridor ended at a door which she opened. Outside lay another black man, a giant in turban and silk loincloth, with a curved sword lying on the flags near his hand. He did not move. "I drugged his wine," she whispered, swerving to avoid the recumbent figure. "He is the last and outer guard of the pits. None ever escaped from them before, and none has ever wished to seek them. So only these black men guard them. Only these of all the servants knew it was King Conan that Zaltotun brought a prisoner in his chariot. I was watching, sleepless, from an upper casement that opened into the court, while the other girls slept, for I knew that a battle was being fought, or had been fought, in the west, and I feared for you. I saw the blacks carry you up the stair, and I recognized you in the torchlight. I slipped into this wing of the palace tonight, in time to see them carry you to the pits. I had not dared come here before nightfall. You must have lain in drugged senselessness all day in Zaltotun's chamber. Oh, let us be wary. Strange things are afoot in the palace tonight. The slaves said that Zaltotun slept as he often sleeps, drugged by the lotus of Stygia. But Taraskus is in the palace. He entered secretly through the postern, wrapped in his cloak which was dusty as with long travel, and attended only by his squire, the lean, silent Aridius. I cannot understand, but I am afraid." They came out at the foot of a narrow, winding stair, and mounting it, passed through a narrow panel which she slid aside. When they had passed through, she slipped it back in place, and it became merely a portion of the ornate wall. They were in a more spacious corridor, carpeted and tapestried, over which hanging lamps shed a golden glow. Conan listened intently, but he heard no sound throughout the palace. He did not know in what part of the palace he was, or in which direction lay the chamber of Zaltotun. The girl was trembling as she drew him along the corridor, to halt presently beside an alcove masked with satin tapestry. Drawing this aside, she motioned for him to step into the niche and whispered, "Wait here. Beyond that door at the end of the corridor we are likely to meet slaves or eunuchs at any time of the day or night. I will go and see if the way is clear before we essay it." Instantly his hair-trigger suspicions were aroused. "Are you leading me into a trap?" Tears sprang into her dark eyes. She sank to her knees and seized his muscular hand. "Oh, my king, do not mistrust me now." Her voice shook with desperate urgency. "If you doubt and hesitate, we are lost. Why should I bring you up out of the pit to betray you now?" "All right," he muttered. "I'll trust you, though, by Crom, the habits of a lifetime are not easily put aside. Yet I wouldn't harm you now if you brought all the swordsmen in the media upon me. But for you, Taraskus's cursed ape would have come upon me in chains and unarmed. Do as you wish, girl." Kissing his hands, she sprang lithely up and ran down the corridor to vanish through a heavy double door. He glanced after her, wondering if he was a fool to trust her. Then he shrugged his mighty shoulders and pulled the satin hangings together, masking his refuge. It was not strange that a passionate young beauty should be risking her life to aid him. Such things had happened often enough in his life. Many women had looked on him with favor in the days of his wanderings and in the time of his kingship. Yet he did not remain motionless in the alcove, waiting for her return. Following his instincts, he explored the niche for another exit, and presently found one, the opening of a narrow passage, masked by the tapestries that ran to an ornately carved door, barely visible in the dim light that filtered in from the outer corridor. And as he stared into it, somewhere beyond that carven door, he heard the sound of another door opening and shutting, and then a low mumble of voices. The familiar sound of one of those voices caused a sinister expression to cross his dark face. Without hesitation, he glided down the passage and crouched like a stalking panther beside the door. It was not locked, and manipulating it delicately, he pushed it open a crack with a reckless disregard for possible consequences that only he could have explained or defended. It was masked on the other side by tapestries, but through a thin slit in the velvet he looked into a chamber lit by a candle on an ebony table. There were two men in that chamber. One was a scarred, sinister-looking ruffian in leather breeks and ragged cloak. The other was Taraskus, king of Nemedia. Taraskus seemed ill at ease. He was slightly pale, and he kept starting and glancing about him, as if expecting and fearing to hear some sound or footstep. "Go swiftly and at once," he was saying. "He is deep in drugged slumber, but I know not when he may awaken." "Strange to hear words of fear issuing from the lips of Taraskus," rumbled the other in a harsh, deep voice. The king frowned. "I fear no common men, as you well know. But when I saw the cliffs fall at Valkia, I knew that this devil we had resurrected was no charlatan. I fear his powers because I do not know the full extent of them. But I know that somehow they are connected with this accursed thing which I have stolen from him. It brought him back to life, so it must be the source of his sorcery. He had it hidden well, but following my secret order, a slave spied on him and saw him place it in a golden chest, and saw where he hid the chest. Even so, I would not have dared steal it had Zaltatun himself not been sunk in lotus slumber. I believe it is the secret of his power. With it, Orestes brought him back to life. With it, he will make us all slaves if we are not wary. So take it and cast it into the sea as I have bidden you. And be sure you are far from land that neither tide nor storm can wash it up on the beach. You have been paid."
"Yes, I have," grunted the ruffian, "and I owe more gold to you, king. I owe you a debt of gratitude. Even thieves can be grateful."
"Whatever debt you may feel you owe me," answered Taraskus, "will be paid when you have hurled this thing into the sea."
"I'll ride for Zingara and take ship from Cordova," promised the other. "I dare not show my head in Argos because of the matter of a murder or so."
"I care not, so it is done. Here it is. A horse awaits you in the court. Go, and go swiftly."
Something passed between them, something that flamed like living fire. Conan had only a brief glimpse of it, and then the ruffian pulled a slouch hat over his eyes, drew his cloak about his shoulder, and hurried from the chamber. And as the door closed behind him, Conan moved with the devastating fury of unchained bloodlust. He had held himself in check as long as he could. The sight of his enemy so near him set his wild blood seething and swept away all caution and restraint. Taraskus was turning toward an inner door when Conan tore aside the hangings and leaped like a blood-mad panther into the room. Taraskus wheeled, but even before he could recognize his attacker, Conan's poniard ripped into him. But the blow was not mortal, as Conan knew the instant he struck. His foot had caught in a fold of the curtains and tripped him as he leaped. The point fleshed itself in Taraskus's shoulder and plowed down along his ribs, and the king of Numidia screamed. The impact of the blow and Conan's lunging body hurled him back against the table, and it toppled and the candle went out. They were both carried to the floor by the violence of Conan's rush, and the foot of the tapestry hampered them both in its folds. Conan was stabbing blindly in the dark, Taraskus screaming in a frenzy of panicky terror. As if fear lent him superhuman energy, Taraskus tore free and blundered away in the darkness, shrieking,
"Help! Guards! Aridius! Orestes! Orestes!"
Conan rose, kicking himself free of the tangling tapestries and the broken table, cursing with the bitterness of his bloodthirsty disappointment. He was confused and ignorant of the plan of the palace. The yells of Taraskus were still resounding in the distance, and a wild outcry was bursting forth in answer. The Numidian had escaped him in the darkness, and Conan did not know which way he had gone. The Cimmerian's rash stroke for vengeance had failed, and there remained only the task of saving his own hide if he could. Swearing luridly, Conan ran back down the passage and into the alcove, glaring out into the lighted corridor, just as Zenobia came running up it, her dark eyes dilated with terror.
"Oh, what has happened?" she cried. "The palace is roused. I swear I have not betrayed you."
"No, it was I who stirred up the hornets' nest," he grunted. "I tried to pay off a score. What's the shortest way out of this?" She caught his wrist and ran fleetly down the corridor. But before they reached the heavy door at the other end, muffled shouts arose from behind it, and the portals began to shake under an assault from the other side. Zenobia wrung her hands and whimpered,
"We are cut off. I locked that door as I returned through it, but they will burst it in a moment. The way to the postern gate lies through it."
Conan wheeled. Up the corridor, though still out of sight, he heard a rising clamor that told him his foes were behind as well as before him.
"Quick, into this door!"
the girl cried desperately, running across the corridor and throwing open the door of a chamber. Conan followed her through, and then through the gold catch behind them. They stood in an ornately furnished chamber, empty but for themselves, and she drew him to a gold-barred window through which he saw trees and shrubbery.
"You are strong,"
she panted.
"If you can tear these bars away, you may yet escape. The garden is full of guards, but the shrubs are thick, and you may avoid them. The southern wall is also the outer wall of the city. Once over that, you have a chance to get away. A horse is hidden for you in a thicket beside the road that runs westward, a few hundred paces to the south of the fountain of Thrallos. You know where it is?"
"Aye, but what of you? I had meant to take you with me." A flood of joy lighted her beautiful face.
"Then my cup of happiness is brimming, but I will not hamper your escape. Burdened with me you would fail. Nay, do not fear for me. They will never suspect that I aided you willingly. Go! What you have just said will glorify my life throughout the long years."
He caught her up in his iron arms, crushed her slim, vibrant figure to him, and kissed her fiercely on eyes, cheeks, throat, and lips, until she lay panting in his embrace, gusty and tempestuous as a storm wind. Even his love-making was violent. "I'll go," he muttered, "but by Crom, I'll come for you someday." Wheeling, he gripped the gold bars and tore them from their sockets with one tremendous wrench, threw a leg over the sill, and went down swiftly, clinging to the ornaments on the wall. He hit the ground running and melted like a shadow into the maze of towering rose bushes and spreading trees. The one look he cast back over his shoulder showed him Zenobia leaning over the windowsill, her arms stretched after him in mute farewell and renunciation. Guards were running through the garden, all converging toward the palace, where the clamor momentarily grew louder. Tall men in burnished cuirasses and crested helmets of polished bronze. The starlight struck glints from their gleaming armor among the trees, betraying their every movement. But the sound of their coming ran far before them. To Conan, wilderness-bred, their rush through the shrubbery was like a blundering stampede of cattle. Some of them passed within a few feet of where he lay flat in a thick cluster of bushes, and never guessed his presence. With the palace as their goal, they were oblivious to all else about them. When they had gone shouting on, he rose and fled through the garden with no more noise than a panther would have made. So quickly he came to the southern wall and mounted the steps that led to the parapet. The wall was made to keep people out, not in. No sentry patrolling the battlements was in sight. Crouching by an embrasure, he glanced back at the great palace rearing above the cypresses behind him. Lights blazed from every window, and he could see figures flitting back and forth across them like puppets on invisible strings. He grinned hardly, shook his fist in a gesture of farewell and menace, and let himself over the outer rim of the parapet. A low tree a few yards below the parapet received Conan's weight as he dropped noiselessly into the branches. An instant later he was racing through the shadows with a swinging hillman's stride that eats up long miles. Gardens and pleasure villas surrounded the walls of Belverus. Drowsy slaves sleeping by their watchmen's pikes did not see the swift and furtive figure that scaled walls, crossed alleys made by the arching branches of trees, and threaded a noiseless way through orchards and vineyards. Watchdogs woke and lifted their deep booming clamor at a gliding shadow, half scented, half sensed, and then it was gone. In a chamber of the palace, Taraskus writhed and cursed on a blood-spattered couch under the deft, quick fingers of Orestes. The palace was thronged with wide-eyed, trembling servitors, but the chamber where the king lay was empty save for himself and the renegade priest. "Are you sure he still sleeps?" Taraskus demanded again, setting his teeth against the bite of the herb juices with which Orestes was bandaging the long, ragged gash in his shoulder and ribs. "Ishtar Mitra Seth that burns like a molten pitch of hell." "Which you would be experiencing even now, but for your good fortune," remarked Orestes. "Whoever wielded that knife struck to kill. Yes, I have told you that Zaltotun still sleeps. Why are you so urgent upon that point? What has he to do with this? You know nothing of what has passed in the palace tonight." Taraskus searched the priest's countenance with burning intensity. "Nothing. As you know, I have been employed in translating manuscripts for Zaltotun for some months now, transcribing esoteric volumes written in the younger languages into script he can read. He was well versed in all the tongues and scripts of his day, but he has not yet learned all the newer languages, and to save time he has made me translate these works for him, to learn if any new language has been discovered since his time. I did not know that he had returned last night until he sent for me and told me of the battle. Then I returned to my studies, nor did I know that you had returned until the clamor in the palace brought me out of my cell. Then you do not know that Zaltotun brought the king of Aquilonia a captive to this palace." Orestes shook his head without particular surprise. "Zaltotun merely said that Conan would oppose us no more. I supposed that he had fallen, but did not ask the details. Zaltotun saved his life when I would have slain him," snarled Taraskus. "I saw his purpose instantly. He would hold Conan captive to use as a club against us, against Amalric, against Valerius, and against myself. So long as Conan lives, he is a threat, a unifying factor for Aquilonia that might be used to compel us into courses we would not otherwise follow. I mistrust this undead Pythonian. Of late, I have begun to fear him. I followed him some hours after he had departed eastward. I wished to learn what he intended doing with Conan. I found that he had imprisoned him in the pits. I intended to see that the barbarian died, in spite of Zaltotun, and I accomplished. A cautious knock sounded at the door. "That's Aridius," grunted Taraskus. "Let him in." The saturnine squire entered, his eyes blazing with suppressed excitement. "How, Aridius?" exclaimed Taraskus. "Have you found the man who attacked me?" You did not see him, my lord? Asked Aridius, as one who would assure himself of a fact he already knows to exist. You did not recognize him? No, it happened so quick, and the candle was out. All I could think of was that it was some devil loosed on me by Zaltotun's magic. The Pythonian sleeps in his barred and bolted room, but I have been in the pits. Aridius twitched his lean shoulders excitedly. Well, speak, man, exclaimed Taraskus impatiently. What did you find there? An empty dungeon, whispered the squire. The corpse of the great ape. What? Taraskus started upright, and blood gushed from his open wound. Aye, the man-eater is dead, stabbed through the heart, and Conan, he's gone. Taraskus was grey of face as he mechanically allowed Orestes to force him prostrate again, and the priest renewed work upon his mangled flesh. Conan, he repeated, not a crushed corpse, escaped. Mitra, he is no man, but a devil himself. I thought Zaltotun was behind this wound. I see now. Gods and devils, it was Conan who stabbed me. Aridius, aye, your majesty. Search every nook in the palace. He may be skulking through the dark corridors now like a hungry tiger. Let no niche escape your scrutiny. And beware, it is not a civilized man you hunt, but a blood-mad barbarian whose strength and ferocity are those of a wild beast. Scour the palace grounds and the city. Throw a cordon about the walls. If you find he has escaped from the city, as he may well do, take a troop of horsemen and follow him. Once past the walls, it will be like hunting a wolf through the hills. But haste, and you may yet catch him. This is a matter which requires more than ordinary human wits, said Orestes. Perhaps we should seek Zaltotun's advice. No, exclaimed Taraskus violently. Let the troopers pursue Conan and slay him. Zaltotun can hold no grudge against us if we kill a prisoner to prevent his escape. Well, said Orestes, I am no Acharonian, but I am versed in some of the arts and the control of certain spirits which have cloaked themselves in material substance. Perhaps I can aid you in this matter. The fountain of Thrallos stood in a clustered ring of oaks beside the road a mile from the walls of the city. Its musical tinkle reached Conan's ears through the silence of the starlight. He drank deep of its icy stream and then hurried southward toward a small, dense thicket he saw there. Rounding it, he saw a great white horse tied among the bushes. Heaving a deep, gusty sigh, he reached it with one stride. A mocking laugh brought him about, glaring. A dully glinting, mail-clad figure moved out of the shadows into the starlight. This was no plumed and burnished palace guardsman. It was a tall man in morion and grey chain mail, one of the adventurers, a class of warriors peculiar to Nemedia, men who had not attained to the wealth and position of knighthood, or had fallen from that estate. Hard-bitten fighters dedicating their lives to war and adventure. They constituted a class of their own, sometimes commanding troops, but themselves accountable to no man but the king. Conan knew that he could have been discovered by no more dangerous a foeman. A quick glance among the shadows convinced him that the man was alone, and he expanded his great chest slightly, digging his toes into the turf and his thews coiled tensely. "I was riding for Belverus on Amalric's business," said the adventurer, advancing warily. The starlight was a long sheen on the great two-handed sword he bore naked in his hand. A horse whined to mine from the thicket. I investigated and thought it strange a steed should be tethered there. I waited, and lo, I have caught a rare prize." The adventurers lived by their swords.
"I know you," muttered the Nemedian. "You are Conan, king of Aquilonia. I thought I saw you die in the valley of the Valkia, but—" Conan sprang as a dying tiger springs. Practiced fighter though the adventurer was, he did not realize the desperate quickness that lurks in barbaric sinews. He was caught off guard, his heavy sword half lifted. Before he could either strike or parry, the king's poniard sheathed itself in his throat above the gorget, slanting downward into his heart. With a choked gurgle, he reeled and went down, and Conan ruthlessly tore his blade free as his victim fell. The white horse snorted violently and sheathed at the sight and scent of blood on the sword. Glaring down at his lifeless enemy, dripping poniard in hand, sweat glistening on his broad breast, Conan poised like a statue, listening intently. In the woods about, there was no sound, save for the sleepy cheep of awakened birds. But in the city, a mile away, he heard the strident blare of a trumpet. Hastily, he bent over the fallen man. A few seconds' search convinced him that whatever message the man might have borne was intended to be conveyed by word of mouth. But he did not pause in his task. It was not many hours until dawn. A few minutes later, the white horse was galloping westward along the white road, and the rider wore the grey mail of an Nemedian adventurer. Chapter 7. The Rending of the Whale. Conan knew his only chance of escape lay in speed. He did not even consider hiding somewhere near Belverus until the chase passed on. He was certain that the uncanny ally of Taraskus would be able to ferret him out. Besides, he was not one to skulk and hide. An open fight or an open chase, either suited his temperament better. He had a long start, he knew. He would lead them a grinding race for the border. Zenobia had chosen well in selecting the white horse. His speed, toughness and endurance were obvious. The girl knew weapons and horses, and Conan reflected with some satisfaction she knew men. He rode westward at a gait that ate up the miles. It was a sleeping length through which he rode, past grove-sheltered villages and white-walled villas, amid spacious fields and orchards that grew sparser as he fared westward. As the villages thinned, the land grew more rugged, and the keeps that frowned from eminences told of centuries of border war. But none rode down from those castles to challenge or hold him. The lords of the keeps were following the banner of Amalric. The pennons that were wont to wave over these towers were now floating over the Aquilonian plains. When the last huddled village fell behind him, Conan left the road, which was beginning to bend toward the northwest, toward the distant passes. To keep to the road would mean to pass by border towers, still garrisoned with armed men who would not allow him to pass unquestioned. He knew there would be no patrols riding the border marches on either side, as in ordinary times, but there were those towers, and with dawn there would probably be cavalcades of returning soldiers with wounded men on ox carts. This road from Belverus was the only road that crossed the border for 50 miles from north to south. It followed a series of passes through the hills, and on either hand lay a wide expanse of wild, sparsely inhabited mountains. He maintained his due westerly direction, intending to cross the border deep in the wilds of the hills that lay to the south of the passes.
It was a shorter route, more arduous, but safer for a hunted fugitive. One man on a horse could traverse country an army would find impassable. But at dawn he had not reached the hills. They were a long, low blue rampart stretching along the horizon ahead of him. Here there were neither farms nor villages, no white-walled villas looming among the clustering trees. The dawn wind stirred the tall, stiff grass, and there was nothing but the long, rolling swells of brown earth, covered with dry grass, and in the distance the gaunt walls of a stronghold on a low hill. Too many Aquilonian raiders had crossed the mountains in not too distant days for the countryside to be thickly settled as it was farther to the east. Dawn ran like a prairie fire across the grasslands, and high overhead sounded a weird crying as a straggling wedge of wild geese winged swiftly southward. In a grassy swale Conan halted and unsaddled his mount. Its sides were heaving, its coat plastered with sweat. He had pushed it unmercifully through the hours before dawn. While it munched the brittle grass and rolled, he lay at the crest of the low slope, staring eastward. Far away to the northward he could see the road he had left, streaming like a white ribbon over a distant rise. No black dots moved along that glistening ribbon. There was no sign about the castle to the distance to indicate that the keepers had noticed the lone wayfarer. An hour later the land still stretched bare. The only sign of life was a glint of steel on the far-off battlements, a raven in the sky that wailed backward and forth, dipping and rising as if seeking something. Conan saddled and rode westward at a more leisurely gait. As he topped the farther crest of the slope, a raucous screaming burst out over his head, and looking up, he saw the raven flapping high above him, cawing incessantly. As he rode on, it followed him, maintaining its position and making the morning hideous with its strident cries, heedless of his efforts to drive it away. This kept for hours until Conan's teeth were on edge, and he felt that he would give half his kingdom to be allowed to wring that black neck. "Devils of hell!" he roared in futile rage, shaking his mailed fist at the frantic bird. "Why do you harry me with your squawking? Begone, you black spawn of perdition, and beg for wheat in the farmer's fields!" He was ascending the first pitch of the hills, and he seemed to hear an echo of the birds' clamor far behind him. Turning in his saddle, he presently made out another black dot hanging in the blue. Beyond that again he caught the glint of the afternoon sun on steel. That could mean only one thing: armed men. And they were not riding along the beaten road, which was out of his sight beyond the horizon. They were following him. His face grew grim, and he shivered slightly as he stared at a raven that wheeled high above him. "So it is more than the whim of a brainless beast," he muttered. "Those riders cannot see you, spawn of hell, but the other bird can see you, and you can see him. You follow me, he follows you, and they follow him. Are you only a craftily trained feathered creature, or some devil in the form of a bird? Did Zaltotun set you on my trail? Are you Zaltotun?" Only a strident screech answered him, a screech vibrating with harsh mockery. Conan wasted no more breath on his dusky betrayer. Grimly he settled to the long grind of the hills. He dared not push the horse too hard. The rest he had allowed it had not been enough to freshen it. He was still far ahead of his pursuers, but they would cut down that lead steadily. It was almost a certainty that their horses were fresher than his, for they had undoubtedly changed mounts at that castle he had passed. The going grew rougher, the scenery more rugged, steep grassy slopes pitching up to densely timbered mountainsides. Here he knew he might elude his hunters, but for that hellish bird that squalled incessantly above him. He could no longer see them in this broken country, but he was certain that they still followed him, guided unerringly by their feathered allies. That black shape became like a demonian incubus, hounding him through measureless hells. The stones he hurled with a curse went wide or fell harmless, though in his youth he had felt hawks on the wing. The horse was tiring fast. Conan recognized the grim finality of his position. He sensed an inexorable driving fate behind all this. He could not escape. He was as much a captive as he had been in the pits of Belvarus. But he was no son of the Orient to yield passively to what seemed inevitable. If he could not escape, he would at least take some of his foes into eternity with him. He turned into a wide thicket of larches that masked a slope, looking for a place to turn at bay. Then, ahead of him, there rang a strange, shrill scream, human yet weirdly timbred. An instant later, he had pushed through a screen of branches and saw the source of that eldritch cry. In a small glade below him, 4 soldiers in Nemedian chainmail were binding a noose about the neck of a gaunt old woman in peasant garb. A heap of faggots, bound with cord on the ground nearby, showed what her occupation had been when surprised by these stragglers. Conan felt slow fury swell his heart as he looked silently down and saw the ruffians dragging her toward a tree whose low spreading branches were obviously intended to act as a gibbet. He had crossed the frontier an hour ago. He was standing on his own soil, watching the murder of one of his own subjects. The old woman was struggling with surprising strength and energy, and as he watched, she lifted her head and voiced again the strange, weird, far-carrying call he had heard before. It was echoed as if in mockery by the raven flapping above the trees. The soldiers laughed roughly, and one struck her in the mouth. Conan swung from his weary steed and dropped down the face of the rocks, landing with a clang of mail on the grass. The 4 men wailed at the sound and drew their swords, gaping at the mailed giant who faced them, sword in hand. Conan laughed harshly. His eyes were bleak as flint. "Dogs!" he said without passion and without mercy. "Do Nemedian jackals set themselves up as executioners and hang my subjects at will? First, you must take the head of their king. Here I stand, awaiting your lordly pleasure." The soldiers stared at him uncertainly as he strode towards them. "Who is this madman?" growled a bearded ruffian. "He wears Nemedian mail, but speaks with an Aquilonian accent." "No matter," quoth another. "Cut him down, and then we'll hang the old hag." And so saying, he ran at Conan, lifting his sword. But before he could strike, the king's great blade lashed down, splitting helmet and skull. The man fell before him, but the others were hardy rogues. They gave tongue like wolves and surged about the lone figure in the grey mail, and the clamour and din of steel drowned the cries of the circling raven. Conan did not shout. his eyes coals of blue fire and his lips smiling bleakly. He lashed right and left with his two-handed sword. For all his size, he was quick as a cat on his feet, and he was constantly in motion, presenting a moving target so that thrusts and swings cut empty air oftener than not. Yet, when he struck, he was perfectly balanced, and his blows fell with devastating power. 3 of the 4 were down, dying in their own blood, and the 4th was bleeding from half a dozen wounds, stumbling in headlong retreat as he parried frantically when Conan's spear caught in the surcoat of one of the fallen men. The king stumbled, and before he could catch himself, the Nemedian, with the frenzy of desperation, rushed him so savagely that Conan staggered and fell sprawling over the corpse. The Nemedian croaked in triumph and sprang forward, lifting his great sword with both hands over his right shoulder, as he braced his legs wide for the stroke. And then, over the prostrate king, something huge and hairy shot like a thunderbolt full on the soldier's breast, and his yelp of triumph changed to a shriek of death. Conan, scrambling up, saw the man lying dead with his throat torn out, and a great grey wolf stood over him, head sunk as it smelled the blood that formed a pool on the grass. The king turned as the old woman spoke to him. She stood straight and tall before him, and in spite of her ragged garb, her features, clear-cut and aquiline, and her keen black eyes, were not those of a common peasant woman. She called to the wolf, and it trotted to her side like a great dog, and rubbed its giant shoulder against her knee, while it gazed at Conan with great green lambent eyes. Absently she laid her hand upon its mighty neck, and so the two stood regarding the king of Aquilonia. He found their steady gaze disquieting, though there was no hostility in it. "Men say King Conan died beneath the stones and dirt when the cliffs crumbled by Valkia," she said in a deep, strong, resonant voice. "So they say," he growled. He was in no mood for controversy, and he thought of those armored riders who were pushing nearer every moment. The raven above him cawed stridently, and he cast an involuntary glare upward, grinding his teeth in a spasm of nervous irritation. Up on the ledge the white horse stood with drooping head. The old woman looked at it, and then at the raven, and then she lifted a strange weird cry as she had before. As if recognizing the call, the raven wheeled, suddenly mute, and raced eastward. But before it had got out of sight, the shadow of mighty wings fell across it. An eagle soared up from the tangle of trees, and rising above it, swooped and struck the black messenger to the earth. The strident voice of betrayal was stilled forever. "Grum," muttered Conan, staring at the old woman. "Are you a magician too?" "I am Zelata," she said. "The people of the valleys call me a witch. Was that child of the night guiding armed men on your trail?" "Aye." She did not seem to think the answer fantastic. "They cannot be far behind me." "Lead your horse and follow me, King Conan," she said briefly. Without comment, he mounted the rocks and brought his horse down to the glade by a circuitous path. As he came, he saw the eagle reappear, dropping lazily down from the sky, and rest an instant on Zelatus's shoulder, spreading its great wings lightly so as not to crush her with its weight. Without a word, she led the way, the great wolf trotting at her side, the eagle soaring above her. Through deep thickets and along tortuous ledges, poised over deep ravines, she led him, and finally along a narrow precipice-edged path to a curious dwelling of stone, half hut, half cavern, beneath a cliff hidden among the gorges and crags. The eagle flew to the pinnacle of this cliff and perched there like a motionless sentinel. Still silent, Zelata stabled the horse in a nearby cave with leaves and grass piled high for provender, and a tiny spring bubbling in the dim recesses. In the hut she seated the king on a rude hide-covered bench, and she herself sat upon a low stool before the tiny fireplace, where she made a fire of tamarisk chunks and prepared a frugal meal. The great wolf drowsed beside her, facing the fire, his huge head sunk on his paws, his ears twitching in his dreams. "You do not fear to sit in the hut of a witch?" she asked, breaking her silence at last. An impatient shrug of his grey male shoulders was her guest's only reply. She gave into his hands a wooden dish heaped with dry fruits, cheese and barley bread, and a great pot of heady upland beer brewed from barley grown in the high valleys. "I have found the brooding silence of the glens more pleasing than the babble of city streets," she said. "The children of the wild are kinder than the children of men." Her hand briefly stroked the ruff of the sleeping wolf. "My children were far from me today, or I had not needed your sword, my king. They were coming at my call." "What grudge had those Nemedian dogs against you?" Conan demanded.
"Skulkers from the invading army straggle all over the countryside, from the frontier to Tarantia," she answered. "The foolish villagers in the valleys told them that I had a store of gold hidden away, so as to divert their attentions from their villages. They demanded treasure from me, and my answers angered them. But neither skulkers nor the men who pursue you, nor any raven will find you here."
He shook his head, eating ravenously. "I am for Tarantia." She shook her head.
"You thrust your head into the dragon's jaws. Best seek refuge abroad. The heart is gone from your kingdom."
"What do you mean?" he demanded. "Battles have been lost before, yet wars won. A kingdom is not lost by a single defeat."
"And you will go to Tarantia?"
"Aye. Prospero will be holding it against Amalric."
"Are you sure?"
"Hell's devils, woman!" he exclaimed wrathfully. "What else?" She shook her head.
"I feel that it is otherwise. Let us see. Not lightly is the veil rent, yet I will rend it a little and show you your capital city."
Conan did not see what she cast upon the fire, but the wolf whimpered in his dreams, and a green smoke gathered and billowed up into the hut. And as he watched, the walls and ceiling of the hut seemed to widen, to grow remote and vanish, merging with infinite immensities. The smoke rolled about him, blotting out everything, and in its forms moved and faded and stood out in startling clarity. He stared at the familiar towers and streets of Tarantia, where a mob seethed and screamed, and at the same time he was somehow able to see the banners of Nemedia moving inexorably westward through the smoke and flame of a pillaged land. In the great square of Tarantia, the frantic throng milled and yammered, screaming that the king was dead, that the barons were girding themselves to divide the land between them, and that the rule of a king, even of Valerius, was better than anarchy. Prospero, shining in his armor, rode among them, trying to pacify them, bidding them trust Count Trocero, urging them to man the wall and aid his knights in defending the city. They turned on him, shrieking with fear and unreasoning rage, howling that he was Troceros's butcher, a more evil foe than Amalric himself. Offal and stones were hurled at his knights. A slight blurring of the picture that might have denoted a passing of time, and then Conan saw Prospero and his knights filing out of the gates and spurring southward. Behind him the city was in an uproar. "Fools!" muttered Conan thickly. "Fools! Why could they not trust Prospero? Zelata, if you're making game of me with some trickery—"
"This has passed,"
answered Zelata imperturbably, though somberly.
"It was the evening of the day that has passed when Prospero rode out of Tarentia with the hosts of Amalric almost within sight. From the walls men saw the flame of their pillaging. So I read it in the smoke. At sunset the Nemedians rode into Tarentia unopposed. Look, even now in the royal hall of Tarentia."
Abruptly Conan was looking into the great coronation hall. Valerius stood on the regal dais, clad in ermine robes, and Amalric, still in his dusty blood-stained armor, placed a rich and gleaming circlet on his yellow locks, the crown of Aquilonia. The people cheered. Long lines of steel-clad Nemedian warriors looked grimly on, and nobles long in disfavor at Conan's court strutted and swaggered with the emblem of Valerius on their sleeves. "Grum!" It was an unexplosive imprecation from Conan's lips as he started up, his great fists clenched into hammers, his veins on his temples knotting, his features convulsed. "A Nemedian placing the crown of Aquilonia on that renegade in the royal hall of Tarentia!" As if dispelled by his violence, the smoke faded, and he saw Zelatus's black eyes gleaming at him through the mist.
"You have seen. The people of your capital have forfeited the freedom you won for them by sweat and blood. They have sold themselves to the slavers and the butchers. They have shown that they do not trust their destiny. Can you rely upon them for the winning back of your kingdom?"
"They thought I was dead," he grunted, recovering some of his poise. "I have no son. Men can't be governed by a memory. What if the Nemedians have taken Tarentia? There still remain the provinces, the barons, and the people of the countrysides. Valerius has won an empty glory."
"You are stubborn, as befits a fighter. I cannot show you the future. I cannot show you all the past. Nay, I show you nothing. I merely make you see windows opened in the veil by powers unguessed. Would you look into the past for a clue of the present?"
"Aye." He seated himself abruptly. Again the green smoke rose and billowed. Again images unfolded before him, this time alien and seemingly irrelevant. He saw great towering black walls, pedestals half hidden in the shadows upholding images of hideous, half bestial gods. Men moved in the shadows, dark, wiry men clad in red, silken loincloths. They were bearing a green jade sarcophagus along a gigantic black corridor. But before he could tell much about what he saw, the scene shifted. He saw a cavern dim, shadowy, and haunted with a strange, intangible horror. On an altar of black stone stood a curious golden vessel, shaped like the shell of a scallop. Into this cavern came some of the same dark, wiry men who had borne the mummy case. They seized the golden vessel, and then the shadows swirled around them, and what happened he could not say. But he saw a glimmer in a whirl of darkness like a ball of living fire. Then the smoke was only smoke, drifting up from the fire of tamarisk chunks, thinning and fading.
But what does this portend?
He demanded, bewildered.
What I saw in Tarantia I can understand, but what means this glimpse of Zamorian thieves sneaking through a subterranean temple of Set in Stygia? And that cavern, I have never seen or heard of anything like it in all my wanderings. If you can show me that much, these shreds of vision which mean nothing, disjointed, why can you not show me all that is to occur?
Zalata stirred the fire without replying.
These things are governed by immutable laws, she said at last. I cannot make you understand. I do not altogether understand myself, though I have sought wisdom in the silences of the high places for more years than I can remember. I cannot save you, though I would if I might. Man must at last work out his own salvation. Yet perhaps wisdom may come to me in dreams, and in the morn I may be able to give you the clue to this enigma.
What enigma?
He demanded.
The mystery that confronts you, whereby you have lost a kingdom,
she answered, and then she spread a sheepskin upon the floor before the hearth.
Sleep,
she said briefly. Without a word he stretched himself upon it and sank into the restless but deep sleep through which phantoms moved silently and monstrous shapeless shadows crept. Once, limned against a purple sunless horizon, he saw the mighty walls and towers of a great city, of such as rose nowhere on the waking earth he knew. Its colossal pylons and purple minarets lifted towards the stars, and over it, floating like a giant mirage, hovered the bearded countenance of the man Zaltotun. Conan woke in the chill whiteness of early dawn to see Zalata crouched beside the tiny fire. He had not awakened once in the night, and the sound of the great wolf leaving or entering should have roused him. Yet the wolf was there, beside the hearth, with its shaggy coat wet with dew, and with more than dew. Blood glistened wetly amid the thick fell, and there was a cut upon his shoulder. Zalata nodded without looking around, as if reading the thoughts of her royal guest.
He has haunted before dawn, and red was his hunting. I think the man who hunted a king will hunt no more, neither man nor beast.
Conan stared at the great beast with strange fascination as he moved to take the food Zalata offered him.
When I come to my throne again, I won't forget,
he said briefly.
You've befriended me. By Crom, I can't remember when I've lain down and slept at the mercy of man or woman as I did last night. But what of the riddle you would read me this morning?
A long silence ensued, in which the crackle of the tamarisks was loud on the hearth.
Find the heart of your kingdom, she said at last. There lies your defeat and your power. You fight more than mortal men. You will not press the throne again unless you find the heart of your kingdom.
Do you mean the city of Tarantia?
She shook her head. I am but an oracle, through whose lips the gods speak. My lips are sealed by them, lest I speak too much. You must find the heart of your kingdom. I can say no more. My lips are opened and sealed by the gods. Dawn was still white on the peaks when Conan rode westward. A glance back showed him Zelata standing in the door of her hut, inscrutable as ever, the great wolf beside her. A grey sky arched overhead, and a moaning wind was chill with a promise of winter. Brown leaves fluttered slowly down from the bare branches, sifting upon his mailed shoulders. All day he pushed through the hills, avoiding roads and villages. Toward nightfall he began to drop down from the heights, tier by tier, and saw the broad plains of Aquilonia spread out beneath him. Villages and farms lay close to the foot of the hills on the western side of the mountains, for half a century most of the raiding across the frontier had been done by the Aquilonians. But now only embers and ashes showed where farm huts and villas had stood. In the gathering darkness, Conan rode slowly on. There was little fear of discovery, which he dreaded from friend as well as from foe. The Numidians had remembered old scores on their westward drive, and Valerius had made no attempt to restrain his allies. He did not count on winning the love of the common people. A vast swath of desolation had been cut through the country from the foothills westward. Conan cursed as he rode over blackened expanses that had been rich fields, and saw the gaunt gable ends of burned houses jutting against the sky. He moved through an empty and deserted land like a ghost out of a forgotten and outworn past. The speed with which the army had traversed the land showed what little resistance it had encountered. Yet, had Conan been leading his Aquilonians, the invading army would have been forced to buy every foot they gained with their blood. The bitter realization permeated his soul. He was not the representative of a dynasty. He was only a lone adventurer. Even the drop of dynastic blood Valerius boasted had more hold on the minds of men than the memory of Conan and the freedom and power he had given the kingdom. No pursuers followed him down out of the hills. He watched for wandering or returning Numidian troops, but met none. Skulkers gave him a wide path, supposing him to be one of the conquerors. What of his harness? Groves and rivers were far more plentiful on the western side of the mountains, and coverts for concealment were not lacking. So he moved across the pillaged land, halting only to rest his horse, eating frugally of the food Zelata had given him, until, on the dawn when he lay hidden on a river bank where willows and oaks grew thickly, he glimpsed afar across the rolling plains dotted with rich groves the blue and golden towers of Tarantia. He was no longer in a deserted land, but one teeming with varied life. His progress thenceforth was slow and cautious, through thick woods and unfrequented byways. It was dusk when he reached the plantation of Servius Galenus. Chapter 8 Dying Embers. The countryside about Tarantia had escaped the fearful ravaging of the more easterly provinces. There were evidences of the march of a conquering army in broken hedges, plundered fields and looted granaries, but torch and steel had not been loosed wholesale. There was but one grim splotch on the landscape,
a charred expanse of ashes and blackened stone, where Conan knew had once stood the stately villa of one of his staunchest supporters. The king dared not openly approach the Gallinus farm, which lay only a few miles from the city. In the twilight he rode through an extensive woodland until he sighted a keeper's lodge through the trees. Dismounting and trying his horse, he approached the thick arched door with the intention of sending the keeper after Servius. He did not know what enemies the manor house might be sheltering. He had seen no troops, but they might be quartered all over the countryside. But as he drew near, he saw the door open and a compact figure in silk hose and richly embroidered doublet stride forth and turned up a path that wound away through the woods. "Servius!" At the low call, the master of the plantation wheeled with a startled exclamation. His hand flew to the short hunting sword at his hip, and he recoiled from the tall grey steel figure standing in the dusk before him. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What is your mitra?" His breath hissed inward, and his ruddy face paled. "Avaunt!" he ejaculated. "Why have you come back from the grey lands of death to terrify me? I was always your true liegeman in your lifetime." "As I still expect you to be," answered Conan. "Stop trembling, man. I am flesh and blood." Sweating with uncertainty, Servius approached and stared into the face of the mail-clad giant, and then, convinced of the reality of what he saw, he dropped to one knee and doffed his plumed cap. "Your Majesty, truly this is a miracle passing belief. The great bell in the citadel has told your dirge days agone. Men said you died at Valkia, crushed under 1,000,000 tons of earth and broken granite." "It was another in my harness," grunted Conan, "but let us talk later. If there is such a thing as a joint of beef on your board—" "Forgive me, my lord," cried Servius, springing to his feet. "The dust of travel is grey on your mail, and I keep you standing here without rest or sup. Mitra, I see well enough now that you're alive, but I swear when I turned and saw you standing all grey and dim in the twilight, the marrow of my knees turned to water. It is an ill thing to meet a man you thought dead in the woodland at dusk." "Bid the keeper to see my steed, which is tied behind yonder oak," requested Conan, and Servius nodded, drawing the king up the path. The patrician, recovering from his supernatural fright, had become extremely nervous. "I will send a servant from the manor," he said. "The keeper is in his lodge, but I dare not trust even my servants in these days. It is better that only I know of your presence." Approaching the great house that glimmered dimly through the trees, he turned aside into a little used path that ran between close-set oaks, whose intertwining branches formed a vault overhead, shutting out the dim light of the gathering dusk. Servius hurried on through the darkness without speaking, and with something resembling panic in his manner, he presently led Conan through a small side door into a narrow, dimly illuminated corridor. They traversed this in haste and silence, and Servius brought the king into a spacious chamber with a high, oak-beamed ceiling and richly panelled walls. Logs flamed in the wide fireplace, for there was a frosty edge to the air, and a great meat pasty in a stone platter stood smoking on a broad mahogany board. Servius locked the massive door and extinguished the candles that stood in a silver candlestick on the table. leaving the chamber illuminated only by the fire of the hearth. "Your pardon, your majesty," he apologized. "These are perilous times. Spies lurk everywhere. It were better that none be able to peer through the windows and recognize you. This pasty, however, is just from the oven, as I intended supping on my return from talk with my keeper. If your majesty would deign—"
"The light is sufficient,"
grunted Conan, seating himself with scant ceremony and drawing his poniard. He dug ravenously into the luscious dish and washed it down with great gulps of wine from grapes grown in Servius's vineyards. He seemed oblivious to any sense of peril, but Servius shifted uneasily on his settle by the fire, nervously fingering the heavy gold chain about his neck. He glanced continually at the diamond panes of the casement, gleaming dimly in the firelight, and cocked his ear toward the door, as if half expecting to hear the pad of furtive feet in the corridor without. Finishing his meal, Conan rose and seated himself on another settle before the fire.
"I won't jeopardize you long by my presence, Servius," he said abruptly. "Dawn will find me far from your plantation."
"My lord," Servius lifted his hands in expostulation, but Conan waved his protest aside.
"I know your loyalty and your courage. Both are above reproach. But if Valerius has usurped my throne, it would be death for you to shelter me. If you were discovered—"
"I am not strong enough to defy him openly," admitted Servius. "The 50 men-at-arms I could lead to battle would be but a handful of straws. You saw the ruin of Aemilius Scavenus's plantation." Conan nodded, frowning darkly. "He was the strongest patrician in this province, as you know. He refused to give his allegiance to Valerius. The Numidians burned him in the ruins of his own villa. After that, the rest of us saw the futility of resistance, especially as the people of Tarantia refused to fight. We submitted, and Valerius spared our lives, though he levied a tax upon us that will ruin many. But what could we do? We thought you were dead. Many of the barons had been slain, others taken prisoner. The army was shattered and scattered. You have no heir to take the crown. There was no one to lead us."
"Was there not Count Trossero of Poitain?"
demanded Conan harshly. Servius spread his hands helplessly. "It is true that his general Prospero was in the field with a small army. Retreating before Amalric, he urged men to rally to his banner. But with your majesty dead, men remembered old wars and civil brawls, and how Trossero and his Poitanians once rode through these provinces, even as Amalric was riding now, with torch and sword. The barons were jealous of Trossero. Some men, spies of Valerius perhaps, shouted that the Count of Poitain intended seizing the crown for himself. Old sectional hates flared up again. If we had had one man with dynastic blood in his veins, we would have crowned and followed him against Numidia. But we had none. The barons who followed you loyally would not follow one of their own number, each holding himself as good as his neighbor, each fearing the ambition of the others. You were the cord that held the faggots together. When the cord was cut, the faggots fell apart. If you had had a son, the barons would have rallied loyally to him. But there was no point for their patriotism to focus upon. The merchants and commoners, dreading anarchy and a return of feudal days, when each baron was his own law, cried out that any king was better than none, even Valerius, who was at least of the blood of the old dynasty. There was no one to oppose him when he rode up at the head of his steel-clad hosts, with the scarlet dragon of Nemedia floating over him, and rang his lance against the gates of Tarantia. Nay, the people threw open the gates and knelt in the dust before him. They had refused to aid Prospero in holding the city. They said they had rather be ruled by Valerius than by Trocero. They said, truthfully, that the barons would not rally to Trocero, but that many would accept Valerius. They said that by yielding to Valerius, they would escape the devastation of civil war and the fury of the Nemedians. Prospero rode southward with his 10,000 knights, and the horsemen of the Nemedians entered the city a few hours later. They did not follow him. They remained to see that Valerius was crowned in Tarantia.
Then the old witch's smoke showed the truth, muttered Conan, feeling a queer chill along his spine. Amalric crowned Valerius.
Aye, in the coronation hall, with the blood of slaughter scarcely dried on his hands.
And do the people thrive under his benevolent rule?
Asked Conan with angry irony. He lives like a foreign prince in the midst of a conquered land, answered Servius bitterly. His court is filled with Nemedians. The palace troops are of the same breed, and a large garrison of them occupy the citadel. Aye, the hour of the dragon has come at last. Nemedians swagger like lords through the streets. Women are outraged and merchants plundered daily, and Valerius either can or will make no attempt to curb them. Nay, he is but their puppet, their figurehead. Men of sense knew he would be, and the people are beginning to find it out. Amalric has ridden forth with a strong army to reduce the outlying provinces where some of the barons have defied him. But there is no unity among them. Their jealousy of each other is stronger than their fear of Amalric. He will crush them one by one. Many castles and cities, realizing that, have sent in their submission. Those who resist fare miserably. The Nemedians are glutting their long hatred, and their ranks are swelled by Aquilonians whom fear, gold, or necessity of occupation are forcing into their armies. It is a natural consequence. Conan nodded somberly, staring at the red reflections of the firelight on the richly carved oaken panels. Aquilonia has a king instead of the anarchy they feared, said Servius at last. Valerius does not protect his subjects against his allies. Hundreds who could not pay the ransom imposed upon them have been sold to the Gothic slave traders. Conan's head jerked up, and a lethal flame lit his blue eyes. He swore gustily, his mighty hands knotting into iron hammers. Aye, white men sell white men and white women, as it was in the feudal days. In the palaces of Shem and of Turan they will live out the lives of slaves. Valerius is king, but a unity for which the people looked, even though of the sword, is not complete. Cumberland in the north and Poitain in the south are yet unconquered, and there are unsubdued provinces in the west where the border barons have the backing of the Bossonian bowmen. Yet these outlying provinces are no real menace to Valerius. They must remain on the defensive, and will be lucky if they are able to keep their independence. Here Valerius and his foreign knights are supreme.
Let him make the best of it then,
said Conan grimly.
His time is short. The people will rise when they learn that I'm alive. We'll take Tarantia back before Amalric can return with his army. Then we'll sweep these dogs from the kingdom.
Servius was silent. The crackle of the fire was loud in the stillness.
Well,
exclaimed Conan impatiently.
Why do you sit with your head bent, staring at the hearth? Do you doubt what I have said?
Servius avoided the king's eye. What mortal man can do, you will do, your majesty, he answered. I have ridden behind you in battle, and I know that no mortal being can stand before your sword.
What then?
Servius drew his fur-trimmed jupon closer about him, and shivered in spite of the flame. Men say your fall was occasioned by sorcery, he said presently.
What then?
What mortal can fight against sorcery? Who is this veiled man who communes at midnight with Valerius and his allies, as men say, who appears and disappears so mysteriously? Men say in whispers that he is a great magician who died thousands of years ago, but has returned from death's grey lands to overthrow the king of Aquilonia and restore the dynasty which Valerius is heir.
What matter?
Exclaimed Conan angrily.
I escaped from the devil-haunted pits of Belverus and from diabolism in the mountains if the people rise.
Servius shook his head. Your staunchest supporters in the eastern and central provinces are dead, fled or imprisoned. Cumberland is far to the north, Poitain far to the south. The Bossonians have retired to their marches far to the west. It would take weeks to gather and concentrate these forces, and before that could be done, each levy would be attacked separately by Amalric and destroyed.
But an uprising in the central provinces would tip the scales for us,
exclaimed Conan.
We could seize Tarantia and hold it against Amalric until the Gundermen and Pointanians could get here.
Servius hesitated, and his voice sank to a whisper. Men say you died accursed. Men say this veiled stranger cast a spell upon you to slay you and break your army. The great bell has tolled your dirge. Men believe you to be dead, and the central provinces would not rise, even if they knew you lived. They would not dare. Sorcery defeated you at Valkia. Sorcery brought the news to Tarantia, for that very night men were shouting of it in the streets. An Nemedian priest loosed black magic again in the streets of Tarantia to slay men who still were loyal to your memory. I myself saw it. Armed men dropped like flies and died in the streets in a manner no man could understand. And the lean priest laughed and said, I am only Altaro, only an acolyte of Orestes, who is but an acolyte of him who wears the veil. Not mine is the power but works through me.
Well,
said Conan harshly,
it is not better to die honorably than to live in infamy. Is death worse than oppression, slavery, and ultimate destruction?
When the fear of sorcery is in, reason is out, replied Servius. The fear of the central provinces is too great to allow them to rise for you. The outlying provinces would fight for you, but the same sorcery that smote your army at Valkia would smite you again. The Nemedians hold the broadest, richest, and most thickly populated sections of Aquilonia, and they cannot be defeated by the forces which might still be at your command. You would be sacrificing your loyal subjects uselessly. In sorrow I say it, but it is true. King Conan, you're a king without a kingdom."
Conan stared into the fire without replying. A smoldering log crashed down among the flames without a bursting shower of sparks. It might have been the crashing ruin of his kingdom. Again, Conan felt the presence of a grim reality behind the veil of material illusion. He sensed again the inexorable drive of a ruthless fate. A feeling of furious panic tugged at his soul, a sense of being trapped, and a red rage that burned to destroy and kill.
"Where are the officials of my court?"
he demanded at last.
Valentides was sorely wounded at Valkia, was ransomed by his family, and now lies in his castle at Athens. He will be fortunate if he ever rise again. Publius, the chancellor, has fled the kingdom in disguise, and no man knows whither. The council has been disbanded. Some were imprisoned, some banished. Many of your loyal subjects have been put to death. Tonight, for instance, the Countess Albiona died under the headsman's axe.
Conan started and stared at Servius with such anger smoldering in his blue eyes that the patrician shrank back.
"Why?"
"Because she would not become the mistress of Valerius. Her lands are forfeit, her henchmen sold into slavery, and at midnight in the iron tower her head must fall. Be advised, my king, to me you will ever be my king, and flee before you are discovered. In these days none is safe. Spies and informers creep among us, betraying the slightest deed or word of discontent as treason and rebellion. If you make yourself known to your subjects, it will only end in your capture and death. My horses and all the men that I can trust are at your disposal. Before dawn we can be far from Tarantia and well on our way toward the border. If I cannot aid you to recover your kingdom, I can at least follow you into exile." Conan shook his head. Servius glanced uneasily at him as he sat staring into the fire, his chin propped on his mighty fist. The firelight gleamed redly on his steel mail, on his baleful eyes. They burned in the firelight like the eyes of a wolf. Servius was again aware, as in the past, and now more strongly than ever, of something alien about the king. That great frame under the mail mesh was too hard and supple for a civilized man. The elemental fire of the primitive burned in those smoldering eyes. Now the barbaric suggestion about the king was more pronounced, as if in his extremity the outward aspects of civilization were stripped away to reveal the primordial core. Conan was reverting to his pristine type. He did not act as a civilized man would act under the same conditions, nor did his thoughts run in the same channels. He was unpredictable. It was only a stride from the king of Aquilonia to the skin-clad slayer of the Cimmerian hills.
"I'll ride to Poitain, if it may be,"
Conan said at last,
"but I'll ride alone, and I have one last duty to perform as a king of Aquilonia."
"What do you mean, your majesty?" asked Servius, shaken by a premonition.
"I'm going into Tarantia after Albiona tonight,"
answered the king.
"I've failed all my other loyal subjects, it seems. If they take her head, they can have mine too."
"This is madness!" cried Servius, staggering up and clutching his throat as if he already felt the noose closing about it.
"There are secrets to the tower which few know," said Conan. "Anyway, I'd be a dog to leave Albiona to die because of her loyalty to me. I may be a king without a kingdom, but I'm not a man without honor."
"It will ruin us all," whispered Servius.
"It will ruin no one but me if I fail. You've risked enough. I ride alone tonight. This is all I want you to do. Procure me a badge for my eye, a staff for my hand, and garments such as travelers wear."
Chapter 9. It is a king or his ghost. Many men pass through the great arch gates of Tarantia between sunset and midnight, belated travelers, merchants from afar with heavily laden mules, free workmen from the surrounding farms and vineyards. Now that Valerius was supreme in the central provinces, there was no rigid scrutiny of the folk who flowed in a steady stream through the wide gates. Discipline had been relaxed. The Numidian soldiers who stood on guard were half drunk and much too busy watching for handsome peasant girls and rich merchants who could be bullied to notice workmen or dusty travelers. Even one tall wayfarer whose worn cloak could not conceal the hard lines of his powerful frame. This man carried himself with an erect, aggressive bearing that was too natural for him to realize it himself, much less dissemble it. A great patch covered one eye, and his leather coif, drawn low over his brows, shadowed his features. With a long, thick staff in his muscular brown hand, he strode leisurely through the arch where the torches flared and guttered, and, ignored by the tipsy guardsmen, emerged upon the wide streets of Tarantia. Upon these well-lighted thoroughfares, the usual throngs went about their business, and shops and stalls stood open with their wares displayed. One thread ran a constant theme through the pattern. Numidian soldiers, singly or in clumps, swaggered through the throngs, shouldering their way with studied arrogance. Women scurried from their path, and men stepped aside with darkened brows and clenched fists. The Aquilonians were a proud race, and these were their hereditary enemies. The knuckles of the tall traveler knotted on his staff, but, like the others, he stepped aside to let the men in armor have the way. Among the motley and varied crowd, he did not attract much attention in his drab, dusty garments. But once, as he passed a sword seller's stall, and the light that streamed from its wide door fell full upon him, he thought he felt an intense stare upon him, and turning quickly, saw a man in the brown jerkin of a free workman regarding him fixedly. This man turned away with undue haste and vanished in the shifting throng. But Conan turned into a narrow by-street and quickened his pace. It might have been more idle curiosity, but he could take no chances. The grim iron tower stood apart from the citadel amid a maze of narrow streets and crowding houses, where the meaner structures, appropriating a space from which the more fastidious shrank, had invaded a portion of the city ordinarily alien to them. The tower was in reality a castle, an ancient formidable pile of heavy stone and black iron, which had itself served as the citadel in an earlier, ruder century. Not a long distance from it, lost in a tangle of partly deserted tenements and warehouses, stood an ancient watchtower,
so old and forgotten that it did not appear on the maps of the city for 100 years back. Its original purpose had been forgotten, and nobody of such as saw it at all noticed that the apparently ancient lock which kept it from being appropriated as sleeping quarters by beggars and thieves was in reality comparatively new and extremely powerful, cunningly disguised into an appearance of rusty antiquity. Not half a dozen men in the kingdom had ever known the secret of that tower. No keyhole showed in the massive green-crusted lock, but Conan's practiced fingers, stealing over it, pressed here and there knobs invisible to the casual eye. The door silently opened inward, and he entered solid blackness, pushing the door shut behind him. A light would have showed the tower empty, a bare cylindrical shaft of massive stone. Groping in a corner with the sureness of familiarity, he found the projections for which he was feeling on a slab of the stone that composed the floor. Quickly he lifted it, and without hesitation lowered himself into the aperture beneath. His feet felt stone steps leading downward into what he knew was a narrow tunnel that ran straight toward the foundation of the iron tower, 3 streets away. The bell on the citadel, which tolled only at the midnight hour or for the death of a king, boomed suddenly. In a dimly lighted chamber in the iron tower, a door opened and a form emerged into a corridor. The interior of the tower was as forbidding as its external appearance. Its massive stone walls were rough, unadorned. The flags of the floor were worn deep by generations of faltering feet, and the vault of the ceiling was gloomy in the dim light of torches set in niches. The man who trudged down that grim corridor was in appearance in keeping with his surroundings. He was a tall, powerfully built man, clad in close-fitting black silk. Over his head was drawn a black hood which fell about his shoulders, having 2 holes for his eyes. From his shoulders hung a loose black cloak, and over one shoulder he bore a heavy axe, the shape of which was that of neither tool nor weapon. As he went down the corridor, a figure came hobbling up it, a bent, surly old man, stooping under the weight of his pike and a lantern he bore in one hand.
"You are not as prompt as your predecessor, Master Headsman," he grumbled. "Midnight has just struck, and masked men have gone to my lady's cell. They await you."
"The tones of the bell still echo among the towers," answered the executioner.
"If I am not so quick to leap and run at the back of Aquilonians as was the dog who held this office before me, they shall find my arm no less ready. Get to your duties, old watchman, and leave me to mine. I think mine is the sweeter trade by Mitra, for you tramp cold corridors and peer at rusty dungeon doors, while I lop off the fairest head in Tarantia this night."
The watchman limped on down the corridor, still grumbling, and the headsman resumed his leisurely way. A few strides carried him around a turn in the corridor, and he absently noted that at his left a door stood partly open. If he had thought, he would have known that that door had been opened since the watchman passed, but thinking was not his trade. He was passing the unlocked door before he realized that aught was amiss, and then it was too late. A soft tigerish step and the rustle of a cloak warned him, but before he could turn, a heavy arm hooked about his throat from behind, crushing the cry before it could reach his lips. In the brief instant that was allowed him, he realized with a surge of panic the strength of his attacker, against which his own brawny thews were helpless. he sensed without seeing the poised dagger.
"Nemedian dog,"
muttered a voice thick with passion in his ear.
"You cut off your last Aquilonian head."
And that was the last thing he ever heard. In a dank dungeon, lighted only by a guttering torch, 3 men stood about a young woman who knelt on the rush-strewn flags, staring wildly up at them. She was clad only in a scanty shift. Her golden hair fell in lustrous ripples about her white shoulders, and her wrists were bound behind her. Even in the uncertain torchlight, and in spite of her disheveled condition and pallor of fear, her beauty was striking. She knelt mutely, staring with wide eyes up at her tormentors. The men were closely masked and cloaked. Such a deed as this needed masks, even in a conquered land. She knew them all nevertheless, but what she knew would harm no one after that night.
"Our merciful sovereign offers you one more chance, Countess,"
said the tallest of the 3, and he spoke Aquilonian without an accent.
"He bids me say that if you soften your proud, rebellious spirit, he will still open his arms to you. If not—"
He gestured toward a grim wooden block in the center of the cell. It was blackly stained and showed many deep nicks, as if a keen edge, cutting through some yielding substance, had sunk into the wood. Albiona shuddered and turned pale, shrinking back. Every fiber in her vigorous young body quivered with the urge of life. Valerius was young, too, and handsome. Many women loved him, she told herself, fighting with herself for life. But she could not speak the word that would ransom her soft young body from the block and the dripping axe. She could not reason the matter. She only knew that when she thought of the clasp of Valerius's arms, her flesh crawled with an abhorrence greater than the fear of death. She shook her head helplessly, compelled by an impulsion more irresistible than the instinct to live.
"Then there is no more to be said,"
exclaimed one of the others impatiently, and he spoke with an immediate accent.
"Where is the headsman?"
As if summoned by the word, the dungeon door opened silently, and a great figure stood framed in it, like a black shadow from the underworld. Albiona voiced a low, involuntary cry at the sight of that grim shape, and the others stared silently for a moment, perhaps themselves daunted with superstitious awe at the silent, hooded figure. Through the coif the eyes blazed like coals of blue fire, and as these eyes rested on each man in turn, he felt a curious chill travel down his spine. Then the tall Aquilonian roughly seized the girl and dragged her to the block. She screamed uncontrollably and fought hopelessly against him, frantic with terror, but he ruthlessly forced her to her knees and bent her yellow head down to the bloody block.
"Why do you delay, headsman?"
he exclaimed angrily.
"Perform your task."
He was answered by a short, gusty boom of laughter that was indescribably menacing. All in the dungeon froze in their places, staring at the hooded shape, the 2 cloaked figures, the masked man bending over the girl herself on her knees, twisting her imprisoned head to look upward.
"What means this unseemly mirth, dog?"
demanded the Aquilonian uneasily. The man in the black garb tore his hood from his head and flung it to the ground. He set his back to the closed door and lifted the headsman's axe.
"Do you know me, dogs?"
he rumbled.
"Do you know me?"
The breathless silence was broken by a scream.
"The king!"
shrieked Albiona, wrenching herself free from the slackened grasp of her captor.
"Oh, Mitra, the king!"
The three men stood like statues, and then the Aquilonian started and spoke like a man who doubts his own senses.
"Conan!"
he ejaculated.
"It is the king or his ghost! What devil's work is this?"
"Devil's work to match devils," mocked Conan, his lips laughing but hell flaming in his eyes. "Come, fall to, my gentlemen. You have your swords, and I this cleaver. Nay, I think this butcher's tool fits the work at hand, my fair lords."
"At him!"
muttered the Aquilonian, drawing his sword.
"It is Conan, and we must kill or be killed."
And, like men waking from a trance, the Nemedians drew their blades and rushed on the king. The headman's axe was not made for such work, but the king wielded the heavy, clumsy weapon as lightly as a hatchet, and his quickness of foot, as he constantly shifted his position, defeated their purpose of engaging him all three at once. He caught the sword of the first man on his axe head and crushed it in the wielder's breast with a murderous counterstroke before he could step back or parry. The remaining Nemedian, missing a savage swipe, had his brains dashed out before he could recover his balance, and an instant later the Aquilonian was backed into a corner, desperately parrying the crushing strokes that rained about him, lacking opportunity even to scream for help. Suddenly, Conan's long left arm shot out and ripped the mask from the man's head, disclosing the pallid features. "Dog!" grated the king. "I thought I knew you. Traitor! Damned renegade! Even this base steel is too honorable for your foul head. Nay, die as thieves die!" The axe fell in a devastating arc, and the Aquilonian cried out and went to his knees, grasping the severed stump of his right arm, from which blood spouted. It had been shorn away at the elbow, and the axe, unchecked in its descent, had gashed deeply into his side, so that his entrails bulged out. "Lie there and bleed to death," grunted Conan, casting the axe away disgustedly. "Come, Countess!" Stooping, he slashed the cords that bound her wrists, and lifting her as if she had been a child, strode out from the dungeon. She was sobbing hysterically, with her arms thrown about his corded neck in a frenzied embrace. "Easy all," he muttered. "We are not out of this yet. If we can reach the dungeon where the secret door opens on stairs that lead to the tunnel, they will take it. They've heard that noise, even through these walls." Down the corridor, arms clanged, and the tramp and shouting of men echoed under the vaulted roof. A bent figure came hobbling swiftly along, lantern held high, and its light shone full on Conan and the girl. With a curse, the Cimmerian sprang toward him, but the old watchman, abandoning both lantern and pike, scuttled away down the corridor, screeching for help at the top of his cracked voice. Deeper shouts answered him. Conan turned swiftly and ran the other way. He was cut off from the dungeon with the secret lock and the hidden door through which he had entered the tower, and by which he had hoped to leave. But he knew this grim building well. Before he was king, he had been imprisoned in it. He turned off into a side passage and quickly emerged into another, broader corridor, which ran parallel to the one down which he had come, and which was at the moment deserted. He followed this only a few yards when he again turned back down another side passage. This brought him back into the corridor he had left, but at a strategic point. A few feet farther up the corridor, there was a heavy bolted door, and before it stood a bearded Nemedian in corselet and helmet, his back to Conan as he peered up the corridor in the direction of the growing tumult and wildly waving lanterns. Conan did not hesitate. Slipping the girl to the ground, he ran at the guard swiftly and silently, sword in hand. The man turned just as the king reached him, bold in surprise and fright, and lifted his pike. But before he could bring the clumsy weapon into play, Conan brought down his sword on the fellow's helmet with a force that would have felled an ox. Helmet and skull gave way together, and the guard crumpled to the floor. In an instant, Conan had drawn the massive bolt that barred the door, too heavy for one ordinary man to have manipulated, and called hastily to Albiona, who ran staggering to him. Catching her up unceremoniously with one arm, he bore her through the door and into the outer darkness. They had come into a narrow alley, black as pitch, walled by the side of the tower on one hand and the sheer stone back of a row of buildings on the other. Conan, hurrying through the darkness as swiftly as he dared, felt the latter wall for doors or windows, but found none. The great door clanged open behind them, and men poured out, with torches gleaming on breastplates and naked swords. They glared about, bellowing, unable to penetrate the darkness which their torches served to illuminate for only a few feet in any direction, and then rushed down the alley at random, heading in the direction opposite to that taken by Conan and Albiona. "They'll learn their mistake quick enough," he muttered, increasing his pace. "If we ever find a crack in this infernal wall, damn the street watch!" Ahead of them, a faint glow became apparent, where the alley opened into a narrow street, and he saw dim figures looming against it with a glimmer of steel. It was indeed the street watch, investigating the noise they had heard echoing down the valley. "Who goes there?" they shouted, and Conan grit his teeth at their hated Nemedian accent. "Keep behind me," he ordered the girl. "We've got to cut our way through before the prison guards come back and pin us between them." And, grasping his sword, he ran straight at the oncoming figures. The advantage of surprise was his. He could see them limned against the distant glow, and they could not see him coming at them out of the black depths of the alley. He was among them before they knew it, smiting with the silent fury of a wounded lion. His one chance lay in hacking through before they could gather their wits. But there were half a score of them, in full mail, hard-bitten veterans of the border wars, in whom the instinct for battle could take the place of bemused wits. 3 of them were down before they realized that it was only one man who was attacking them. But even so, their reaction was instantaneous. The clangor of steel rose deafeningly, and sparks flew as Conan's sword crashed on bassinet and hauberk. He could see better than they, and in the dim light his swiftly moving figure was an uncertain mark. Flailing swords cut empty air or glanced from his blade, and when he struck it was with the fury and certainty of a hurricane. But behind him sounded the shouts of the prison guards, returning up the alley at a run, and still the mailed figures before him barred his way with a bristling wall of steel. In an instant the guards would be on his back. In desperation he redoubled his strokes, flailing like a smith on an anvil, and then was suddenly aware of a diversion. Out of nowhere, behind the watchman rose a score of black figures, and there was a sound of blows murderously driven. Steel glinted in the gloom, and men cried out, struck mortally from behind. In an instant, the alley was littered with writhing forms. A dark cloaked shape sprang towards Conan, who heaved up his sword, catching a gleam of steel in the right hand. But the other was extended to him empty, and a voice hissed urgently, "This way, your majesty! Quickly!" With a muttered oath of surprise, Conan caught up Albiona in one massive arm and followed his unknown befriender. He was not inclined to hesitate, with thirsty prison guardsmen closing in behind him. Surrounded by mysterious figures, he hurried down the alley, carrying the Countess as if she had been a child. He could tell nothing of his rescuers except that they wore dark cloaks and hoods. Doubt and suspicion crossed his mind, but at least they had struck down his enemies, and he saw no better course than to follow them. As if sensing his doubt, the leader touched his arm lightly and said, "Fear not, King Conan, we are your loyal subjects." The voice was not familiar, but the accent was Aquilonian of the central provinces. Behind them, the guards were yelling as they stumbled over the shambles in the mud, and they came pelting vengefully down the alley. Seeing the vague, dark mass moving between them and the light of the distant street. But the hooded men turned suddenly toward the seemingly blank wall, and Conan saw a door gape there. He muttered a curse. He had traversed that alley by day in times past, and he had never noticed a door there. But through it they went, and the door closed behind them with a click of a lock. The sound was not reassuring, but his guides were hurrying him on, moving with the precision of familiarity, guiding Conan with a hand at either elbow. It was like traversing a tunnel, and Conan felt Albionas's lithe limbs trembling in his arms. Then, somewhere ahead of them, an opening was faintly visible, merely a somewhat less black arch in the blackness, and through this they filed. After that, there was a bewildering succession of dim courts and shadowy alleys and winding corridors, all traversed in utter silence, until at last they emerged into a broad lighted chamber, the location of which Conan could not even guess, for their devious route had confused even his primitive sense of direction. Chapter 10. A Coin from Acheron. Not all his guides entered the chamber. When the door closed, Conan saw only one man standing before him, a slim figure masked in a black cloak with hood. This the man threw back, disclosing a pale oval of a face with a calm, delicately chiseled features. The king set Albiona on her feet, but she still clung to him and stared apprehensively about her. The chamber was a large one, with marble walls partly covered with black velvet hangings and thick rich carpets on the mosaic floor, laved in the soft golden glow of bronze lamps. Conan instinctively laid a hand on his hilt. There was blood on his hand, blood clotted about the mouth of his scabbard, for he had sheathed his blade without cleansing it. "Where are we?" he demanded. The stranger answered with a low, profound bow in which the suspicious king could detect no trace of irony. "In the temple of Asura, your majesty!" Albiona cried out faintly and clung closer to Conan, staring fearfully at the black arched doors as if expecting the entry of some grisly shape of darkness. "Fear not, my lady," said their guide. "There is nothing here to harm you. Vulgar superstition to the contrary. If your monarch was sufficiently convinced of the innocence of our religion to protect us from the persecution of the ignorant, then certainly one of his subjects need have no apprehensions." "Who are you?" demanded Conan. "I am Hadratus, priest of Asura. One of my followers recognized you when you entered the city and brought the word to me." Conan grunted profanely. "Do not fear that others discovered your identity," Hadratus assured him. "Your disguise would have deceived any but a follower of Asura, whose cult it is to seek below the aspect of illusion. You were followed to the watchtower, and some of my people went into the tunnel to aid you if you returned by that route. Others, myself among them, surrounded the tower. And now, King Conan, it is yours to command. Here in the temple of Asura, you are still king." "Why should you risk your lives for me?" asked the king. "You were our friend when you sat upon your throne," answered Hadratus. "You protected us when the priests of Mitra sought to scourge us out of the land." Conan looked about him curiously. He had never before visited the temple of Asura, had not certainly known that there was such a temple in Tarantia. The priests of the religion had a habit of hiding their temples in a remarkable fashion. The worship of Mitra was overwhelmingly predominant in the Hyborian nations, but the cult of Asura persisted in spite of official ban and popular antagonism. Conan had been told dark tales of hidden temples where intense smoke drifted up incessantly from black altars where kidnapped humans were sacrificed before a great coiled serpent whose fearsome head swayed forever in the haunted shadows. Persecution caused the followers of Asura to hide their temples with cunning art and to veil their rituals in obscurity. And this secrecy, in turn, evoked even more monstrous suspicions and tales of evil. But Conan's was the broad tolerance of the barbarian, and he had refused to persecute the followers of Asura or to allow the people to do so on no better evidence than was presented against them, rumors and accusations that could not be proven. "If they are black magicians," he had said, "how will they suffer you to harry them? If they are not, there is no evil in them. Crumbs devils, let men worship what gods they will." At a respectful invitation from Hadratus, he seated himself on an ivory chair and motioned Albiona to another, but she preferred to sit on a golden stool at his feet, pressing close against his thigh, as if seeking security in the contact. Like most orthodox followers of Mitra, she had an intuitive horror of the followers and cult of Asura, instilled in her infancy and childhood by wild tales of human sacrifice and anthropomorphic gods shambling through shadowy temples. Hadratus stood before them, his uncovered head bowed. "What is your wish, your majesty?" "Food first," he grunted, and the priest smote a golden gong with a silver wand. Scarcely had the mellow notes ceased echoing when 4 hooded figures came through a curtained doorway, bearing a great 4-legged silver platter of smoking dishes and crystal vessels. This they set before Conan, bowing low, and the king wiped his hands on the damask and smacked his lips with unconcealed relish. "Beware, your majesty," whispered Albiona. "These folk eat human flesh." "I'll stake my kingdom that this is nothing but honest roast beef," answered Conan. "Come, lass, fall to. You must be hungry after the prison fare." Thus advised, and with the example before her of one whose word was the ultimate law to her, the countess complied and ate ravenously though daintily, while her liege lord tore into the meat joints and guzzled the wine with as much gusto as if he had not already eaten once that night.
"Your priests are shrewd, Hadritus,"
he said, with a great beef bone in his hands and his mouth full of meat.
"I'd welcome your service in my campaign to regain my kingdom."
Slowly Hadritus shook his head, and Conan slammed the beef bone down on the table in a gust of impatient wrath.
"Crumbs devils! What ails the men of Aquilonia? First Servius, now you! Can you do nothing but wag your idiotic heads when I speak of ousting these dogs?"
Hadritus sighed and answered slowly,
"My lord, it is ill to say, but I fain would say otherwise. But the freedom of Aquilonia is at an end. Nay, the freedom of the whole world may be at an end. Age follows age in the history of the world, and now we enter an age of horror and slavery as it was long ago." "What do you mean?"
demanded the king uneasily. Hadritus dropped into a chair and rested his elbows on his thighs, staring at the floor. "It is not alone the rebellious lords of Aquilonia and the armies of Nemedia which are arrayed against you," answered Hadritus. "It is sorcery, grisly black magic from the grim youth of the world. An awful shape has risen out of the shades of the past, and none can stand before it." "What do you mean?" Conan repeated. "I speak of Zaltotun of Acheron, who died 3,000 years ago, yet walks the earth today." Conan was silent, while in his mind floated an image, the image of a bearded face of calm, inhuman beauty. Again he was haunted by a sense of uneasy familiarity. Acheron, the sound of the word roused instinctive vibrations of memory and associations in his mind. "Acheron," he repeated, "Zaltotun of Acheron. Man, are you mad? Acheron has been a myth for more centuries than I can remember. I've often wondered if it ever existed at all." "It was a black reality," answered Hadritus, "an empire of black magicians, steeped in evil, now long forgotten. It was finally overthrown by the Hyborian tribes of the West. The wizards of Acheron practiced foul necromancy, thaumaturgy of the most evil kind, grisly magic taught them by devils. And of all the sorcerers of that accursed kingdom, none was so great as Zaltotun of Python." "Then how was he ever overthrown?" asked Conan skeptically. "By some means a source of cosmic power which he jealously guarded was stolen and turned against him. That source has been returned to him, and he is invincible." Albiona, hugging the headman's black cloak about her, stared from the priest to the king, not understanding the conversation. Conan shook his head angrily. "You are making game of me," he growled. "If Zaltotun has been dead 3,000 years, how can this man be he? It's some rogue who's taken the old one's name." Hadritus leaned to an ivory table and opened a small gold chest which stood there. From it he took something which glinted dully in the mellow light, a broad gold coin of antique minting. "You have seen Zaltotun unveiled? Then look upon this. It is a coin which was stamped in ancient Acheron before its fall. So pervaded with sorcery was that black empire that even this coin has its uses in making magic." Conan took it and scowled down at it. There was no mistaking its great antiquity. Conan had handled many coins in the years of his plunderings and had a good practical knowledge of them. The edges were worn and the inscription almost obliterated, but the countenance stamped on one side was still clear-cut and distinct, and Conan's breath sucked in between his clenched teeth. It was not cool in the chamber, but he felt the prickling of his scalp, an icy contraction of his flesh. The countenance was that of a bearded man, inscrutable, with a calm, inhuman beauty. "By Crom, it is he," muttered Conan. He understood now the sense of familiarity that the sight of the bearded man had roused in him from the first. He had seen a coin like this once before, long ago in a far land. With a shake of his shoulders, he growled, "The likeness is only a coincidence, or if he is shrewd enough to assume a forgotten wizard's name, he is shrewd enough to assume his likeness." But he spoke without conviction. The sight of that coin had shaken the foundations of his universe. He felt that reality and stability were crumbling into an abyss of illusion and sorcery. A wizard was understandable, but this was diabolism beyond sanity. "We cannot doubt that it is indeed Zaltotun of Python," said Hadratus. "He it was who shook down the cliffs of Valkia by his spells that enthralled the elements of the earth. He it was who sent the creature of darkness into your tent before dawn." Conan scowled at him. "How did you know that?" "The followers of Asura have secret channels of knowledge. That does not matter, but do you realize the futility of sacrificing your subjects in a vain attempt to regain your crown?" Conan rested his chin on his fist and stared grimly into nothing. Albiona watched him anxiously, her mind groping bewildered in the mazes of the problem that confronted him. "Is there no wizard in the world who could make magic to fight Zaltotun's magic?" he asked at last. Hadratus shook his head. "If there were, we of Asura would know of him. Men say our cult is a survival of the ancient Stygian serpent worship. That is a lie. Our ancestors came from Ventia, beyond the Sea of Vilayet and the blue Hymelian mountains. We are sons of the East, not the South, and we have knowledge of all the wizards of the East, who are greater than the wizards of the West, and not one of them but would be a straw in the wind before the black might of Zaltotun." "But he was conquered once," persisted Conan. "Aye, a cosmic source was turned against him, but now that source is again in his hands, and he will see that it is not stolen again." "And what is this damnable source?" demanded Conan irritably. "It is called the Heart of Ahriman. When Acheron was overthrown, the primitive priest who had stolen it had turned it against Zaltotun, hid it in a haunted cavern, and built a small temple over the cavern. Thrice thereafter the temple was rebuilt, each time greater and more elaborately than before, but always on the site of the original shrine, though men forgot the reason therefor. Memory of the hidden symbol faded from the minds of common men and was preserved only in priestly books and esoteric volumes. Whence it came, no one knows. Some say it is the veritable heart of a god, others that it is a star that fell from the skies long ago. Until it was stolen, none had looked upon it for 3,000 years. When the magic of the Mitran priests failed against the magic of Zaltotun's acolyte Altaro, They remembered the ancient legend of the heart, and the high priest and an acolyte went down in the dark and terrible crypt below the temple, into which no priest had descended for 3,000 years. In the ancient iron-bound volumes which speak of the heart in their cryptic symbolism, it is also told of a creature of darkness left by the ancient priest to guard it. Far down in a square chamber with arched doorways leading off into immeasurable blackness, the priest and his acolyte found a black stone altar that glowed dimly with inexplicable radiance. On that altar lay a curious gold vessel like a double-walled seashell, which clung to the stone like a barnacle, but it gaped open and empty. The heart of Ahriman was gone. While they stared in horror, the keeper of the crypt, the creature of darkness, came upon them and mangled the high priest so that he died. But the acolyte fought off the being, a mindless, soulless waif of the pits brought long ago to guard the heart, and escaped up the long black narrow stairs carrying the dying priest, who, before he died, gasped out the news to his followers, bade them submit to a power they could not overcome, and commanded secrecy. But the word has been whispered about among the priests, and we of Asura learned of it. And Zaltotun draws his power from this symbol? Asked Conan, still skeptical. No, his power is drawn from the Black Gulf. But the heart of Ahriman came from some far universe of flaming light, and against it the powers of darkness cannot stand. When it is in the hands of an adept, it is like a sword that might smite at him, not a sword with which he can smite. It restores life and can destroy life. He has stolen it, not to use it against his enemies, but to keep them from using it against him. A shell-shaped bowl of gold on a black altar in a deep cavern, Conan muttered, frowning as he sought to capture the elusive image. That reminds me of something I have heard or seen. But what in Crum's name is this notable heart? It is in the form of a great jewel like a ruby, but pulsing with blinding fire with which no ruby ever burned. It glows like living flame. But Conan sprang suddenly up and smote his right fist into his left palm like a thunderclap. Crum! He roared, what a fool I've been! The heart of Ahriman, the heart of my kingdom. Find the heart of my kingdom, Zalata said. By Ymir, it was the jewel I saw in the green smoke, the jewel which Taraskus stole from Zaltotun while he lay in the sleep of the Black Lotus. Hadratus was also on his feet. His calm dropped from him like a garment. What are you saying? The heart stolen from Zaltotun? Oi! Conan boomed. Taraskus feared Zaltotun and wanted to cripple his power, which he thought resided in the heart. Maybe he thought the wizard would die if the heart was lost. By Crom! With a savage grimace of disappointment and disgust, he dropped his clenched hand to his side. I forgot. Taraskus gave it to a thief to throw it into a sea. By this time, the fellow must be almost to Cordava. Before I can follow him, he'll take ship and consign the heart to the bottom of the ocean. The sea will not hold it, exclaimed Hadratus, quivering with excitement. Zaltotun would himself have cast it into the ocean long ago, had he not known that the first storm would carry it ashore. But on what unknown beach might it not land? Well, Conan was recovering some of his resilient confidence. There's no assurance that the thief will throw it away. If I know thieves, and I should, for I was a thief in Zamora in my early youth, he won't throw it away. He'll sell it to some rich trader. By Crum!
He strode back and forth in his growing excitement.
It's worth looking for. Zelata bade me find the heart of my kingdom, and all else she showed me proved the truth. Can it be that the power to conquer Zaltotun lurks in that crimson bauble? Aye, my head upon it, cried Hadritus, his face lightened with fervor, his eyes blazing, his fists clenched. With it in our hands, we can dare the powers of Zaltotun. I swear it. If we can recover it, we have an even chance of recovering your crown and driving the invaders from our portals. It is not the swords of Nemedia that Aquilonia fears, but the black arts of Zaltotun.
Conan looked at him for a space, impressed by the priest's fire.
It's like a quest in a nightmare, he said at last. Yet your words echoed the thought of Zelata, and all else she said was truth. I'll seek for this jewel.
It holds the destiny of Aquilonia,
said Hadritus with conviction.
I will send men with you.
Nay,
exclaimed the king impatiently, not caring to be hampered by priests on his quest, however skilled in esoteric arts.
This is a task for a fighting man. I go alone, first to Poitain, where I'll leave Albiona with Tressero, then to Cordava, and to the sea beyond, if necessary. It may be that, even if the thief intends carrying out Taraskus's order, he'll have some difficulty finding an outbound ship at this time of the year.
And if you find a heart, cried Hadritus, I will prepare the way for your conquest. Before you return to Aquilonia, I will spread the word through secret channels that you live and are returning with a magic stronger than Zaltotun's. I will have men ready to rise on your return. They will rise if they have assurance that they will be protected from the black arts of Zaltotun. And I will aid you on your journey.
He rose and struck the gong.
A secret tunnel leads from beneath this temple to a place outside the city walls. You shall go to Poitain on a pilgrim's boat. None will dare molest you.
As you will.
With a definite purpose in mind, Conan was afire with impatience and dynamic energy.
Only let it be done swiftly.
In the meantime, events were moving not slowly elsewhere in the city. A breathless messenger had burst into the palace where Valerius was amusing himself with his dancing girls, and throwing himself on his knee, gasped out a garbled story of a bloody prison break and the escape of a lovely captive. He bore also the news that Count Thespius, to whom the execution of Albionus' sentence had been entrusted, was dying and begging for a word with Valerius before he passed. Hurriedly cloaking himself, Valerius accompanied the man through various winding ways and came to a chamber where Thespius lay. There was no doubt that the Count was dying. Bloody froth bubbled from his lips at each shuddering gasp. His severed arm had been bound to stop the flow of blood, but even without that, the gash in his side was mortal. Alone in the chamber with the dying man, Valerius swore softly.
By Mitra, I had believed that only one man ever lived who could strike such a blow.
Valerius! Gasped the dying man. He lives! Conan lives!
What are you saying?
Ejaculated the other.
I swear by Mitra!
Gurgled Thespius, gagging on the blood that gushed to his lips.
It was he who carried off Albiona. He is not dead. No phantom come back from the hell to haunt us. He is flesh and blood, and more terrible than ever. The alley behind the tower is full of dead men. Beware, Valerius. He has come back to slay us all.
A strong shudder shook the blood-smeared figure, and Count Thespius went limp. Valerius frowned down at the dead man, cast a swift glance about the empty chamber, and, stepping swiftly to the door, cast it open suddenly. The messenger and a group of Numidian guardsmen stood several paces down the corridor. Valerius muttered something that might have indicated satisfaction. "Have all the gates been closed?" he demanded. "Yes, your majesty." "Triple the guards at each. Let no one enter or leave the city without strictest investigation. Set men scouring the streets and searching the quarters. A very valuable prisoner has escaped with the aid of an Aquilonian rebel. Did any of you recognize the man?" "No, your majesty. The old watchman had a glimpse of him, but could only say he was a giant, clad in the black garb of the executioner, whose naked body we found in an empty cell." "He is a dangerous man," said Valerius. "Take no chances with him. You all know the Countess Albiona. Search for her, and if you find her, kill her and her companion instantly. Do not try to take them alive." Returning to his palace chamber, Valerius summoned before him 4 men of curious and alien aspect. They were tall, gaunt, of yellowish skin and immobile countenances. They were very similar in appearance, clad alike in long black robes, beneath which their sandaled feet were just visible. Their features were shadowed by their hoods. They stood before Valerius with their hands in their wide sleeves, their arms folded. Valerius looked at them without pleasure. In his far journeyings he had encountered many strange races. "When I found you starving in the Kithan jungles," he said abruptly, "exiles from your kingdom, you swore to serve me. You have served me well enough in your abominable way. One more service I require, and then I set you free of your oath. Conan the Cimmerian, king of Aquilonia, still lives, in spite of Zaltutun's sorcery, or perhaps because of it. I know not. The dark mind of that resurrected devil is too devious and subtle for a mortal man to fathom. But while Conan lives, I am not safe. The people accepted me as the lesser of 2 evils. When they thought he was dead, let him reappear, and the throne will be rocking under my feet in revolution before I can lift my hand. Perhaps my allies mean to use him to replace me, if they decide I have served my purpose. I do not know. I do know that this planet is too small for 2 kings of Aquilonia. Seek the Cimmerian, use your uncanny talents to ferret him out wherever he hides or runs. He has many friends in Tarantia. He had aid when he carried off Albiona. It took more than 1 man, even such a man as Conan, to wreak all that slaughter in the alley outside the tower. But no more. Take your staffs and strike his trail. Where that trail will lead you I know not, but find him, and when you find him, slay him." The 4 kittens bowed together, and still unspeaking, turned and padded noiselessly from the chamber.